Um, Back to the theater, or maybe I should put it like this: back to the first record, because part of the first record came out of the Tempest, isn't it so?
No.
No.
The Tempest was done after we finished Legging.
It's
It was
Unrest.
the first track of the second side of Unrest.
Yeah,
It's the only thing that survived from the Tempest.
Yeah. Well,
And nothing survived from the Bacchae. I don't think. Although there was some good music in that. Well, what survived is, for instance, the thing that Robert used.
Yeah. Yes. Well, then maybe go to Unrest, because that was a special record in some other ways. Two other ways. You said about that that there was very serious trouble in the group then. Some of the members weren't even on speaking terms with each other at that period. And the second thing was you went to the studio to make that record, but you didn't have enough material, so you had to start composing in the studio.
I don't know if I said we weren't. I don't think I ever said we weren't on speaking terms.
Well, for instance, you called the piece Deluge, which I hope we can play in the program, a very good example of a piece where you can hear, in a way, both things back: your existential feeling about it, and the way the group managed to compose in and with the studio.
Did I say that?
Yeah, you said that in the Henry Cow book.
Well, you'd have to show me.
I'll show you.
I don't remember there being a particular trouble in the band at that time at all. It's true, we didn't have enough material. Jeff had just left. Lindsay joined in the January of that year, and we rehearsed with her for about 3 weeks. She then had all her wisdom teeth taken out.
Yeah.
And we then went into the studio. Now I think any existential qualities that might have been in the music might have had something to do with Lindsay's teeth, but not with big disagreements inside the band, which I don't think there were any at that time. That was a very productive period, as I remember it. And we went in knowing that we didn't have enough material, but thinking that we could handle it. And in fact, we did handle it. I mean, I still think that some of the second side of Unrest, counts amongst some of the best things Henry Cow ever did. And we developed a method working on the second side of that record, which was, again, like working on the Bacchae, incredibly intense and very instructive and educational, because we didn't have any material and we didn't want to improvise. I mean, none of that stuff is like improvisations. We decided that we would make written pieces using the studio, and we used lots of techniques to do that, some of which were to do with improvising, editing, cutting things out, running tapes at the wrong speed. I mean, we just used the studio. And I think that was very positive. We all felt that was very positive. Although, for some reason which I can't any longer recall, we wrapped the whole thing up in this, I called it Unrest. And Ray did the black sock and this picture on the inside, which looks like something out of a German expressionist movie. And I gave things titles like exactly Deluge and Upon Entering the Hotel Adlon and so forth. But I think this was an artistic statement rather than a cry for help from the band. I think this was the object that we'd made, and it had turned out that way not because we'd intended it to turn out that way. Ruins, I've seen lots of interpretations of this piece that come through that title, as if the piece had been written to illustrate the idea, but actually it was my job to give everything titles, and the titles were given long after the record was finished. The pieces didn't ever have titles when they were written, not even working titles mostly. They got titles afterwards, and they got titles that somehow seemed to fit with them, but also which bind everything together. You know, it's obvious, really. I mean, you can either have an album which is just a collection of songs, or you can have something which the parts of it all cross-refer and cross-relate and build up some bigger thing, some idea that's behind them. And the idea behind Unrest was this kind of expressionist, angst-ridden. You know, but I don't think that was about us. That was really about. That was just how we were thinking at the time about the object. You know, it's like when Peter Blegbad writes a song about having affairs with lots of women. It doesn't mean that he's having affairs with lots of women. And when a playwright writes a ghastly, sexist murderer, it doesn't mean that the playwright is expressing himself. And I don't think Henry Cow was expressing itself on Unrest. The angst and the problems came later. Now, he certainly had them, but I don't think that it was then.
Okay. Well, we've talked a little bit about at least how Unrest came together in the studio. But how was the other repertoire of Henry Cow written, or what was the way that the music was born from Henry Cow? Did you use several methods, or
most of the music was produced by Tim or by Fred, occasionally by John, and much later by Lindsay, as scores. They were scores, you know, dots on paper. And they were rehearsed endlessly and changed in rehearsal as and when the band thought they needed to be changed. So all the big pieces like Ruins, or you know, they are all composed by somebody, and then you could say arranged more or less by the group. Lots of incidental music was composed ad hoc by different people for different functions, because we like to link our material together, and we were always changing the set. We were always shifting everything about, and that meant that we always needed to write new bridges and new parts and new linking pieces. And these would be worked out in rehearsals, and these would be worked out, you know, as we went along. And a lot of pieces kept changing. Like, you could do a whole album of different versions of Teen Beat, for instance, which kept on getting rewritten, and sections were taken out and other sections were put in, and it would be chopped up and bits would be moved around and so on. So this happened. But all of it really began in somebody's, you know, on paper from one of the composers.
Was a criterion for you that the music should be played live, should be able to be played live?
No, I don't think we don't remember ever discussing this question, because we were a live band, so by definition everything had to be played live, except, for instance, the kind of things that we did on the second side of Unrest, which we never attempted to perform, and they weren't supposed to be pieces that could be performed. That was tape work. That was for you know, for loudspeakers. But otherwise, we weren't really a record. I mean, none of the records does any justice at all to the band.
Oh, no.
Henry Cow was a much better band than what you hear on those records. We were really a performing group. We spent all our time driving around the place doing concerts, and the concerts were much better than the records.
Yeah, you were mainly playing on the continent, isn't it? Far more than in England.
Yeah, we hardly ever played in England. I mean, not until we broke up in 1978. Between 72 and 78, we hardly ever played here.
How come?
Well, nobody was interested. I mean, the whole Virgin story, what happened was we signed with Virgin, they put the record out. It didn't do particularly well, surprise, surprise. The Virgin agency failed to get us any concerts. I mean, we did a tour with Faust and we did a tour with Beefheart, both of whom were Virgin artists, and that was about it. And had we not got our own gigs, that would have been the end. I mean, and this is what happens to lots of bands, you know, if you put yourself in the hands of some company and they say, well, sorry guys, nobody wants to book you, tough break. And then you say, oh, Henry Cow was different, because we'd already been through the other side of that. You know, when we all moved to London, the first thing we did was run a whole series of concerts ourselves and invited people like Kevin Ayers and Derek Bailey and Lol Coxhill, all these guys to come and play, and then we would play. So we knew all about organising things for ourselves. We knew about standing on our own 2 feet. When the Virgin Agency failed to get us any concerts, we said, well, to hell with the Virgin Agency, and we started to get our own concerts. And all the people who were interested in giving us concerts were in other countries. So starting with Holland, actually, was the first country that we visited. And then France, and then we got very popular in Italy, and so we very rapidly organised our own work, and the people who were interested were people who were somewhere else. So we spent our whole life, you know, living in a bus, driving about Europe, and never playing here.
Yeah. Back to the compositions and the way the music came to life. Did you record more or less live in the studio or not? Besides side 2 of Unrest?
I think Leg End was recorded live with maybe 1 or 2 little overdubs, doubling parts, but it was a live recording. Unrest was recorded live, apart from the studio work, which was built up bit by bit, but the actual songs, you know, Ruins and Half Asleep, Half Awake, they were all live recorded, except we did replace the oboe parts a lot on Half Asleep, Half Awake, because Lindsay was having some trouble with her wisdom teeth. It had all been pulled out, so that was, they were over, but the backings were all done live. In Praise of Learning was recorded live, yes. It wasn't really until when Henry Cow went to record its next record at Sunrise in Switzerland. No, even that was done live. So what became the Art Bears' first record, all the Henry Cow material, or all the material played by Henry Cow on that record, was also done live. I think we always recorded things live. It wasn't until after that, when Fred and I were finishing the Art Bears material, because it wasn't going to be a Henry Cow record anymore, but it was going to be an Art Bears record, that we worked building stuff up track by track in the studio, which is how the Art Bears worked from the beginning. Because of what we'd done with Henry Cow, we said, right, we're not going to do that, we're going to do it a completely different way, we're going to work in a different way. And so I think when Henry Cow came in to do Western Culture, some of that was recorded more part by part. But no, it was basically live recordings, so as far as I can remember. We certainly never did things like backing track and then put on this and then put on that.
You mentioned Hopes and Fears already by Art Bears. You went, I guess it was to Switzerland to record that record,
Yeah.
and originally it was planned to make a new Henry Cow record, but there were, at that moment, at that stage, there were lots of problems in the band. Is that right? Problems that had to do with the kind of the direction that the group had to take.
I'm sure everybody would give you different reasons for why there were problems, but certainly there were lots of problems at this time. We were rehearsing in Clerkenwell. We were rehearsing Tim's big piece, which was going to be on the next record, and one of Lindsay's pieces. And just 3 days before we left for the studio, Lindsay and Tim, no, who was it? It was Lindsay and Fred called a meeting, because we had lots of meetings. Henry Cow was a band that had lots of meetings. You know, we had people, we had a structure. So, every department, somebody was responsible for it. Every week we had a meeting. Later on, we had a women's group inside the band that would have its own meetings. This is how it was. So we had a meeting. Lindsay and Fred said, "We can't record this piece. We don't approve of the texts." It was the text they didn't like. So I got given the job to attempt to rewrite the texts in 3 days, which of course is completely impossible, because this is a 25-minute piece. It was the piece that Tim finally recorded on his record, which was then called "Hold to the Zero Burn." I think it got called then.
With the original text?
With the original text. So that was what it was all about. So I made an attempt, but it was obvious that it wasn't going to be possible. And anyway, I didn't have the same problem that they had with the text, probably because I wrote texts too. So I stayed neutral. I said, well, I think it's okay, and I don't mind recording these texts.
What was their critic?
You have to read the text, and I can't remember anymore, and they'd have to tell you themselves. But I don't remember. I don't remember anymore. But
Okay.
it was strong enough that they said we can't record it. The band doesn't give this its stamp of approval. So instead, I resurrected a couple of texts that I'd already written for songs by Tim and Fred. Joan was already written. The Pirate Song was already written. And started to try and write more short song-type texts, because I thought that was practical. That's something I could do in the time. And so we left the country with no record, basically, with Dagmar flying out 1 week later, because we had some concerts on the way, to do a record that no longer existed. And Hopes and Fears was essentially written on the road, on the way to the studio, and in 2 days of rehearsal that we had in Switzerland somewhere, and in the studio. And Fred and I and Dagmar were very keen on the concept of doing an album of songs, which we thought was a radical departure for a big, epic, orchestral structure piece, Henry Cow band. Now we're going to do pop songs, which of course would have been a big step in a different direction. And since that's what we'd always done, every album we made was a big step in some different direction, we thought this was a legitimate thing to do and practical. By the time we finished making the record, in which we also recorded Half the Sky, Lindsay's instrumental piece, and Viva Pa Ubu, and something else, I don't remember what, we came back to London. Tim then convened a meeting, and Tim said, "This isn't Henry Cow material. We can't put this record out as a Henry Cow record. It's not what we should be doing now." And I said, well, okay, but then let me and Fred, pay the studio costs, and we'll release it as a record ourselves with Dagmar, who was not in the band anymore at that time. She'd come to do the record, but she wasn't in the group, so she wasn't at the meeting either. And by the end of this meeting, we'd agreed that it was time to bust up the band, because we couldn't even agree on something as basic as this, and there wasn't any point in continuing like this, and there was no law that said that Henry Cow had to exist forever and we had to work with each other forever. So why didn't we pack it up? And everybody agreed. And the minute we'd agreed, it was, I don't know how it was for anybody else, but I certainly got the impression that it was like the end of Metamorphosis, you know, where Kay finally dies and then everybody else lives happily. You know, it's a great weight was lifted off their shoulders. So then we all became incredibly positive. And the same meeting, this is the same meeting. Now we've decided to break, you know, first of all we've decided it's not Henry Cow record. Then we've decided that we can take it over and that 2 of the pieces or 3 of the pieces would stay and be on the next real Henry Cow record, but all the songs would come to us. Then we decided that we're going to break the band up. And then we decided that since we were going to break the band up, why didn't we do 9 more months and go and play farewell concerts everywhere that we'd ever been? And while we were about it, why didn't we compose a complete set of new music and stop playing all that old stuff? So that was how the meeting ended. So everybody went off and we wrote a lot of new music, and then we did 9 months of gigs and played everywhere. That's what happened. And then Fred and I wrote a few more texts, and then we went into Kaleidophon studio in London and recorded, I don't know, The Tube, Terrain, Piers, something else.
Joe?
No, that was done with Henry Cow. And those tracks we did track by track. Then this was the first time we used the method, put a click track down, put on the guitar, put on the voice, put on this, put on the drums. And once we'd made that record, as soon as we decided to do the next one, which was Winter Songs, that's how we began with the premise. We began with having learnt from Henry Cow type rules, like everything would be done, built track by track, so that nothing would be there except what was absolutely necessary. And there would be no different takes of a piece. It would just be, we just build each song up. And usually the drums went on last, because I like to do that. I like to put them on when everything else was there, so I could play something to the whole track instead of doing the rhythm track first. We never did the rhythm track first. It's boring. Do the rhythm track last, and it can relate to everything else. And the other rule was no discussion. Absolutely no discussion. If somebody says, I think it would be good to have a guitar doing this here, we wouldn't say, oh no, I don't think it's a good idea. That's what Henry Cow always did. You know, you couldn't do anything because everybody would say whether it was a good idea or not first. So the rule was, you have an idea, do it, and then we'll see if it works. And usually when you do it, either it worked and it was obvious that it worked, or it didn't work and it was obvious that it didn't work, or it was obvious that it could work if it was done a bit different. And so decisions were made, and there was only 2 of us, of course. It was only me and Fred, so decisions were made really fast. That whole album was recorded and mixed in 10 days from start to finish, and the songs were written 7 days before. I mean, the whole thing was done in, like, I don't know, 2 weeks of actual work, from me presenting Fred with the texts to us coming out of the studio with the finished master.
That's Winter Songs, or it's... Yeah.
So it was really efficient. So we discovered this method of working there. And so when we went back to Sunrise to do Western Culture, some of that came back with us.
But one could say that for that development, that Hopes and Fears was a transitional record.
Yes, because although it's advertised as an Art Bears record, 2/3 of it is really, it's Henry Cow. It's the band playing it. It's played in real time, apart from whatever it's called, the dividing line, which you can hear is another track slowed down to half speed that then had, you know, Lindsay wrote over the top of it. But otherwise, it's really Henry Cow, and it could have been a Henry Cow record, and that would have been a whole different story. And of course, the Art Bears wouldn't have existed had Henry Cow put that record out. Fred and I wouldn't have gone on to do those other records, and we wouldn't have developed that work method.
Hopes and Fears is, from another perspective, also a very important record, I guess, because if I'm well informed, it was the first record that was released by your own new label, Recommended Records.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
We're going to talk about that a lot more, I think. But well, we're now just somewhere in the end of the 70s, and what's important is that also when I hear you talking about the new development, it almost sounds as if you were fed up with what happened before. You want to do it completely different. Is that a right conclusion? You didn't want to discuss anymore. You didn't want long pieces anymore. You wanted short pieces. You wanted fast recording. No more meetings. Stop all that.
Hard to say. I don't know if that... I mean, it came out like that, I guess, but as long as we were in Henry Cow, you get used to everything. Pavlov did a very interesting experiment with some very young dogs. He put them in a cage with low steel bars at head level. So these dogs were always bumping their heads against the bars, right from being tiny puppies. So they never knew anything different. So they were never bothered about it. That was normal. That was how life was. You banged your head all the time, and it hurt, and that was it. That's how, conditions of existence. That's how it is. That was how it was being in Henry Cow. I mean, as long as we all thought that the game was worth the candle, as we say in English, as long as we thought that it was better to be in Henry Cow because Henry Cow was producing great music, then all the rest of it is what you had to put up with for that. So if Fred and I weren't on speaking terms for 3 weeks, or the women's group had decided that that they weren't going to do this or that, or whatever it was, or we lived in each other's pockets day in, day out, year in, year out. We didn't have holidays. We were always on tour, and if we weren't on tour, we were rehearsing. And marriage, forget about it. Girlfriends, no time for that. Boyfriends, no time for that either. Or if you have, it's got to fit into the, plus all this political stuff. That was laid on the top because, we were also going through this enormous criticism, self-criticism, Maoist, this, that, and the other. So it was pretty tough being in the band. But on the other hand, everybody thought, well, we get on stage, and it's great. So it's all worth it.
Yeah, that was something that always comes to my mind when I, as an outsider, look at the history of Henry Cow. That you were so harsh on yourself. You always wanted to have new music, never to repeat yourself, and in a way that was the same kind of harshness as your political stand. Maybe it was the same kind of stand, I don't know. But that political position, was that also something in Henry Cow that everything had to be discussed, everything had to be agreed about, every move was decided in the meeting?
Yes, pretty much. Yeah. It was a sort of orthodoxy that was quite hard to break. I mean, I know that especially later on, Fred got increasingly less happy with that whole side of things. He didn't want to discuss everything. He didn't want to find the correct political line. He just wanted to get on with it. But we were, I don't know. I mean, who can explain why these things are the way they were? But that's how it developed, and none of us could escape from it. And essentially, I think that's how it is. That's how it was. That a lot of the band was getting less and less happy with the way things were going, but it was like being in a trap. Nobody could see the way out of it, or that we'd all gone too far, to back off. We didn't know how to back off. Nobody knew how to step back. So the only way to go was forward. Since standing still was not an option, and going back didn't seem to be possible, then forward was the way to go, even if things got broken on the way. That seemed to be the general the way of things. I mean, you can see what happened afterwards. Fred went completely different direction because he did really want to get away, I think, from all of that. And some of the people in Henry Cow remain bitter for years. Some people are still bitter. Yeah.
About what? Bitter about what?
Well, just bitter about how it was. They don't have such good memories about it. They still haven't got over it. I think most of us have, because most of us work with each other. So but it's like leaving home. You have to have a lot of arguments with your parents, and things have to get really bad, and then you leave home, and then 2 or 3 years later you come back and you find out that actually get on quite, they're quite nice, your parents. Actually get on with them all right. Amazing. It's a bit like that with us. So Fred and I were the only ones that immediately carried on working together. And Lindsay and Georgie carried on working together in the feminist improvising group.
Does that regret have something to do with the change of the zeitgeist from a more 60s revolutionary kind of thinking to the more liberal, maybe even right-wing kind of thinking that is now dominant?
I don't think so. I mean, of course, all these things have some part in the story. So that, for instance, in our period, we were able to use and did use a lot of very highly politicized language which one cannot speak anymore. You can't talk like that now. It doesn't mean anything. So in that way, we've moved with the culture that's moved, because of course nobody's going to defend Mao Zedong anymore, are they? Now that we know what's what. So, and those kind of simplistic analyses that one used to make in order to have some clarity are no longer acceptable, because that's too high a price to pay for a bit of clarity. Better to have less clarity and more accuracy and more balance than have lots and lots of clarity and end up being a fanatic. So in that respect, it's true what you say. But in another respect, I don't think anybody changed at a deep level that much. The problem was much more that nobody had any outside life. What gave people a sense of balance and proportion and put everything in perspective was simply, moving in other circles and seeing a bit of the world and realizing that, there's more than one way to do something. I mean, it's the same problem with all kinds of monomania or bigotry. If you stay in some small place and go to the same church every Sunday, you can end up hating everything that's not exactly like your life is, and believing that there's only one truth and only one way to do things, and that's the right way, and everything else is a perversion and is the wrong way. Whereas people that travel a lot, go to different cultures and different countries, and see that everything is done in a different way, and somehow it all still works. So obviously there's more than one way to do things. They tend to be a bit more tolerant. And I think with all the people in Henry Cow, we were all pretty tolerant about different cultures, but about music, about the way that we worked and so forth, although we tried to be very tolerant, there wasn't any outside, really. Hardly. It was all inside. So what made us relax a bit was, getting outside and, doing things in a different way, trying things out. And then we all felt better about, it's like just now, when I didn't remember that things were so bad when we made Unrest. I mean, I really don't remember that. It's all gone now. The thing that I wrote near the time. So obviously it's right. That's how I felt then. But it's gone now. All that's gone now. I don't remember it that way anymore. I remember the good parts, actually, about that period. So, I don't think it was just that. I don't think it's Bob Roberts. You know this movie, Bob Roberts?
Didn't see it.
Great movie. Tim Robbins.
Yeah.
He directed it, he wrote it, he stars in it. It's basically kind of Don't Look Back, Dylan. You know, the 60s turned upside down. So the 60s become the 90s. So he's a nasty right-wing CIA big business character. Only he plays the guitar and all his songs are right-wing. It's just this. It's a negative. It's this, you know, it's the 6 turned upside down. It's like that, and that when that movie was made 7 years ago, it was a very accurate reflection of what's happened. It's exactly right. You know, where we were all 60s radicals, in the 90s everybody's a reactionary yuppie, but the people in Henry Cow, they're not reactionary yuppies, and they didn't really change. Freddie's the same as he was, as I know for sure, and so is Tim, and so is Lindsay actually, in terms of the important beliefs that one had. They didn't change.
Yeah, that's what I would like to ask. What I want to ask you: do you think that your political thinking has radically changed? Would you call yourself still a Marxist?
Yes and no. Yeah, I still think that the general analysis that Marx made of capital stands up pretty well. I don't think that there's a more useful account, a more useful way of looking at certain questions. So in that sense, I'm still a Marxist. However, equally, it's clear that the kinds of communist state that have existed failed miserably and actually delivered less in the long term and are less resilient and less able to adapt to changing conditions than capitalism. Capitalism still has going for it that it's a highly adaptive system, and in an ecology where you want to adapt and survive is about the only thing that counts.